When I was a couple weeks short of my 70th birthday, I started thinking about my mother's mother, who lived to be 100, and her mother, who lived to be 102, and my father, who lived to be 90, longer than anyone we had ever heard of in his family. I began to think that maybe our generation could be the first to routinely live to be 100. When I talked about this at family dinner one night, my granddaughter, who was 5, said,
"What are you going to do for the next 30 years, Grandpa?"
Hello, I'm Dr. Janet Price.
And I'm Gregg Kaloust. And we are Oldish. And this is our podcast, Oldish.
If you're oldish or know someone who is, please join us every week for conversations amongst ourselves
And our special guests
about what it means to be oldish in the 21st century.
If you ever wonder whether you're getting old, you're oldish. What are you going to do for the next 30?
Hi, I'm Greg, and I'm Oldish.
Hi, I'm Janet, and I'm Oldish. Welcome to this episode of Oldish, Conversations on Aging in the 21st Century. We're very excited to have our good friend and colleague, Leslie Ross-Degnan, with us again, so that once more we can look at a book together and talk about being oldish. The book today is a fascinating look at oldishness and what comes next as far as dying, and it's called Walking Each Other Home by Ram Dass and Mirabai Bush. It just has been a lovely, lovely book to read, and I'm looking forward to this conversation. So, Leslie, go ahead and get us started.
Thanks, Janet. I'm happy to be here, and I agree. This was a very fascinating read. There's a little subtitle to this book called Conversations on Loving and Dying with Ram Dass and Mirabai Bush, and two friends having a conversation about love and death. And that sounds very simple, but, well, it isn't. But before I get started, I just want to give a little background on the contributors to this book, which are Ram Dass and Mirabai Bush. Greg and I were just talking about how it was only by reading Ram Dass's first book, Be Here Now, which a lot of our listeners probably know about. If you're oldish, you know who Ram Dass is. And you also probably know that his birth name was Richard Alpert. He was born in Newton, Massachusetts. I don't know how many people knew that. He was born in 1931, and he died in Maui, Hawaii, which is where this book kind of takes place. In 2014, he was about 88 years old when he died, and he's definitely a memorable character from our youthful past days, especially during his time at Harvard with Timothy Leary, who they were colleagues in that time. He had a great education. He came from a very well-educated family, and he was very well-educated from private schools to very well-known universities, and he was a professor at Harvard. He was a psychology professor, and I think Timothy Leary was a game theory professor. But anyway, he and Timothy Leary were actually doing research on the effects of psychedelic hallucinogens. And so they're way ahead of their time. People from Massachusetts know that there was a ballot question about the legalization of hallucinogens. So we've come a long way since Ram Dass, I should say Dr. Albert was doing his research at Harvard. But then eventually it got out of hand, as we all know, and he was called the most dangerous man in the world by Richard Nixon at some point, I think. He was fired from his position at Harvard for breaking research protocol, which really wasn't that stringent back in the 60s. So anyway, I don't want to go into the details of that, but he became a great supporter of humanitarian causes in his older age. He became a spiritual teacher after he went to India and met his guru, the Maharaji. What was his name, Greg? The Maharaji?
His name was Neem Karoli Baba.
So he met him in India. I think he also met Mirabai Bush in India. They've collaborated on other books as well as Walking Each Other Home. He learned a lot from reading the Tibetan Book of the Dead, which promotes death as both a conscious act and a spiritual awakening. And I think that's where the idea for this book came. Not to mention that he was dying. He had already had a stroke, and he was dying when he wrote this book with Mirabai Bush. And a little bit about Mirabai Bush. This book was written through conversations that she had with Ram Dass about dying, and of course about love, because Ram Dass is all about love. after his stroke and shortly before he died. She was a teacher similar to him. She did a lot of classes on, and when she actually herself was a teacher of contemplative practices. Before collaborating with Ram Dass on this book, she collaborated on another book called Compassion in Action. And she's also done a lot of work with insight meditation. So they're on a similar spiritual path. The two of them have been colleagues for years. So when Ram Dass was asked why write this book, this was his answer. I want readers to get rid of their fear of death, to identify with their spiritual selves and be ready, in quotes, when they die. If you know how to live, you know how to die. We are dying every day. Each day is change, and dying is the biggest change. Accepting this could help us live more meaningful lives. That's a pretty big statement. Try and keep that in mind, because we're going to come back to some of that. But I just want to talk about what I thought about this book a little bit and share and have Janet and Gregg also jump in. I found this book very paradoxical. I find a lot of the Eastern philosophies, Buddhism, Hinduism, also even Christianity, and even Judaism, very paradoxical. We all die. Here's the question. We all die, but death is the great unknown. So how do we overcome our fear of death when we have no idea of what death feels like or what actually happens to us when we die? So there's a paradox, but I also found this book strangely comforting. And we don't talk about death and dying. In our culture, we tend to avoid those topics. And Ram Dass just breaks open this conversation for all of us. It's sort of a guidebook for dying, for understanding and unloading our fear of our own death or the death of our loved ones. So let's talk about that. Let's talk about how we're dying every day. Let's talk about aging, being oldish, and getting closer to death. Because as I said, Ram Dass was very close to dying when this book was being imagined and written. And these conversations were going on between he and Mirabai Bush. So aging is a good place to start in this conversation, as this is when we usually begin thoughts about our own death.
I want to talk for a second about the format, because unbeknownst to me, we have been inspired by the format of this book in our podcast, which is conversations. It's not, and Ram Dass and Mirabai Bush were both clear about this, is that their intent, for a good reason that I'll mention in a second, but their intent was not to write a book together. Their intent was to have a conversation as old friends and share that conversation about an important subject with their audience and whoever else might come in contact with it, which is kind of what Janet and I had in mind when we started doing this. So I found this a confirmation and further inspiration. I knew about this book before we started doing this, and I probably had read it somewhat. So it might have been in my mind when I said, Janet, let's have a podcast about conversations. But the format was, I think, really special. Not the least reason for which is that Ram Dass had had a stroke 20 years before this. It wasn't like he had a stroke and then died in a week. His stroke had gone on for 20 years. And one of the things that happened to him in his stroke was that he developed aphasia. So he couldn't write. He had trouble speaking. And the only way that this book could happen would be if somebody who had known him and been really close to him for a very long time, and they met at Maharaj Ji's, I don't know if it was an ashram, but they met when they went to study with Maharaj Ji, and they had remained very close friends the whole rest of their lives. So she knew him so well, and the things that he wanted to talk about, she knew the subject matter so well that she was able to sit and communicate with him. What aphasia is it makes it really difficult to form sentences and click from what you're thinking to what comes out of your mouth. And Ram Dass had a pretty serious case of that. So he would sit for 15, 20 minutes working on a sentence before he could say it. And she was so in tune with him that she could understand what he was saying and then say it back to him for confirmation. That saying it back for confirmation doesn't show up in the book, but it's clear that he essentially approved of everything that she wrote down that he said during the conversations. And so she recorded them, she took notes, but it's because of the depth of their closeness and the love that they had for each other and for their guru that they were able to communicate on a level that was deeper than speech. So that to me is remarkable.
I agree. And I think she was also a very compassionate person in the sense that he was, because I recall during the book, especially towards the end, where she said he became very verbal during certain explanations of dying and the process of it and the connections with love. And she says that in the book. He's actually saying this, very clearly right now. And he's very verbal and verbose. I thought that was very interesting.
Yeah. He probably said 17 words, and that for him was really remarkable.
I was noticing that too, as far as even in the title, Conversations on Loving and Dying, that's the title of our podcast. It starts with conversations. So it just felt very familiar and very connected to how we have thought about the topic of aging. And so he and Mirabai are bringing it to a conversation specifically about dying, which is part of aging.
So what Ram Dass says about aging, and I think this is very relevant to the topic of our podcast, is that aging is freeing. We have fewer attachments. He talks a lot about attachment. Instead of spending so much time denying aging and death, we should be preparing for it. And that I think that's the gist of this book.
I think the other gist of it, or the other message broadly, is like Leslie and you were talking about the paradox of all of this. Like, we're supposed to be in our lives and we're supposed to not be afraid of death, but we don't even know what death is and no one can tell us. I feel like it comes full circle always back to, if we can just acknowledge consciously that this is where we're all headed, like we're walking each other home. It comes back to, how do we live in this moment? Because this is the moment we have. And so then there's a combination of being fully in our lives right now in this moment because we have it, knowing that in some moment, whether it's this next moment or whether it's 20 years from now, we won't have this life anymore. So I feel like it's both a celebration of life and being alive. It's a celebration of community. We're walking each other home. And it's a growing comfortableness of death, and not what we don't know about it, what we do know about it, and then joining together and walking it home together. One of the points he made that meant a lot to me was, he said something about thinking of ourselves as a soul in a human body. And they wrote about how that changed everything for them, because that rather than I'm a human and I'm going to die and my soul will be released somewhere, if that's what you believe, instead it's like, if I'm a soul and I'm walking through this lifetime in this life, this body, it just feels freeing. It's like, it's just part of a process, as opposed to, it's just putting the focus in it's like the right syllable, is putting it in perspective. And I really liked that.
I like that too, because he talks a lot about the body and the soul. He talks about the body's ending, but the soul goes on. And that when you identify as a soul and not a body, then you don't fear death because the soul never dies. I find that really comforting. Yeah.
Yeah.
There's a part of you, whatever you want to call it or whatever your belief is, there's a part of you that lives on, not only through the soul, but he also talks about it as living on through love, the love of your family. And I think we've all had someone who's died. So, we all have had this endless grief when someone dies. But he says that grief seems endless, but it's not. It's just deep. and that one day it'll fill with love, and that we'll move from mourning our dead to remembering them. And that's how love goes on. So maybe
Yes.
love is the soul. I thought about that.
Oh, I like that. I like that a lot. I wrote down one quote, which I think fits in here. And they said, if you know how to live, you know how to die. When people become aware of their own mortality, they are more likely to be kind to themselves and helpful to others. And both their close relationships and wider social connections deepen as well. So that's an interesting thought, because I think sometimes we think of aging as becoming more disconnected, more lonely, more isolated. And I think when it says when people become more aware of their own mortality, they are more likely to be kind to themselves and helpful to others. So it's almost like a charge. It's almost like a task or a mission that we could communicate through this podcast of this is the goal. That as you become more and more aware of your mortality, it can give you an opportunity to be kind, more kind to yourself and helpful to others. Well, wouldn't that be beautiful?
Yeah. And he says the key is to stay in your heart and just
Mhm.
keep loving. Yeah. It's a pretty amazing message.
They both are very clear that their teaching of their guru and their understanding of the nature of life and universe and all of that is all there is love. And so somewhere back in the distant eons ago, according to their traditions that they talk from, Hinduism and Buddhism, and to a certain extent, some of the other isms, way back in the distant past, we all knew that and then forgot it. And so the purpose of rebirth is to remember that. And if you remember it at all, and in his conversations, in their conversations, it was clear that he had remembered that and that he was looking forward to not being separated, not feeling the isolation that we get as a self. I'm a self, you're a self. We are different from each other. We're different from the stupid politicians. We're different from those other people over there. I'm different from a rock. So I'm not aware that who I am really is the universe, and the universe is love, right? So we've forgotten that. And so we can remember it a little bit at a time. That's why in those traditions that believe in reincarnation, that's the reason for the reincarnation, is to learn something each time that you get reborn so that you get closer. And sometimes you succeed and sometimes you don't. Sometimes you pass the pop quiz and sometimes you don't. But it's all the learning of that. And I think that Ram Dass would agree with me when I say that he looked at his stroke, which caused him to sit down and shut up. That caused him to really begin to clearly see that the body that he was in couldn't possibly be all there is, because there's a whole lot of him inside of that body and outside of that body that's not hampered by the disabilities of his body. I don't think he ever did shut up before the stroke. You know, if you look at his life, he was studying, he was teaching, wrote 40 books,
Yeah.
lecturing, running around, being a teacher, being a trainer, helping set things up. He was just booking it all the time. He was just moving all over the place until finally his karma said, sit down and shut up. And he took advantage of that 20 years to really learn who he was, and in such a deep way that he could express it to someone who knew him well enough and was good enough with language to be able to share it with us. And those of us who are oldish have one of the characteristics of oldishness, I think, is starting to wonder what's going to happen next. When you're a kid, you think about, oh yeah, I'm going to die someday. But when you're oldish, if you're not thinking, I might die next Tuesday, you're not paying attention. Because we know for sure that we don't know when we're going to die. And it's probably coming up relatively soon. I'm 74. I'm a lot closer to a likely end in the vicinity of 100 than I was when I was 30.
Yeah, the big question, and
Yeah, go ahead.
well, no, you're just leading me to this thought of one of the big questions that she asked him is, and I'm going to ask you as well, is, you're just saying as we get older, we get closer to death, I don't know, the question was, do you have a new understanding of death now that you're getting closer to it? That's what the question that Mirabai Bush asked him. So we have to get closer to understand it.
It's a really good question. I don't think we have to be older to make peace with it or be aware of it. It can be a lifelong process that can start at any time. When I was attending a Buddhist meditation center, the teacher there would talk often about death. And he would say, I'm talking about death so that we can focus on how to make the most or how to be in this moment and how to be fully present, because that's what life is. And if we spend too much time thinking about the past, worrying about the future, we're missing these moments that we have because we're alive. I have something funny to share, which is I happened to find a app that's called We Croak, and it's one word. So it's capital W-E and then capital C-R-O-A-K. And in that app, it sends 5 times a day a quote about dying. And, clearly the goal is don't forget, you're going to die. And I think that is so cool. So 5 times a day, I get a quote that has to do with dying. And it's like, okay, thank you for reminding me. That's good.
I think that's awesome, Janet. And I think Ram Dass would love it. I honestly think that we avoid the topic of death, which is why I appreciated this book so much. Because, yes, we know we're going to die. We're all going to die. It's inevitable, right? I mean, we're born, we die. And we medicalize birth and death, and they're such natural processes. Why do we avoid the topic of death? Why are we so afraid of it? And he confronts that in this book over and over again and in lots of different ways. We really are afraid to have these conversations about dying.
And I remember, Leslie, at your church, you had someone come in and talk about an actual process to plan and prepare for your death. And so I thought of that as I was reading this book, that there are concrete things like that, concrete guides out there. And it was in the back of the book so that we can make it a normal part of our life. You plan for vacations, you plan for moves, you plan for all these things. You plan for transitions whenever you can. And this is the ultimate transition that we've known since we could understand that this life would end. And yet we tend to not think about it, not plan for it. And planning can include the concrete pieces and also obviously the emotional and spiritual pieces.
Yeah, I think that last bit is one of the important things in the book. And Ram Dass was clear about that. In addition to all of this new agey, we're all one, merging with the universe kind of thing, he also had some clear things that he was doing as a dying human to cover that. Saying goodbye to your friends, having a medical power of attorney. He planned his funeral. Mirabai said, what should we do with your ashes? Because he had decided to be cremated. What should we do with your ashes? He knew. He hadn't thought about it. He had an opinion. They got permission to cremate him in open air and not in a furnace in the back of a room, but to do an open air cremation as they had learned from in India, to share the dying and the new life and the leaving behind of the body with everybody within breathing distance, getting ready for bed in some ways. That before you go to bed, you change your clothes, you brush your teeth, you do these stages, and then you're ready to go on to the next thing.
They had an interesting conversation about being with the dying. She asked him what has gotten you closer to accepting death and letting go of fear. And his answer was being with the dying. And at first I thought, wait a minute, what? But then I thought about my father, who's 99 years old. And he has had some very close near-death experiences. And my sister and brother and I have talked about, we need to talk about dying with Dad because he's getting close. and he doesn't want to talk about it. So that's been, for me, a very interesting experience to think about, how do I talk to my dad about dying? And then he has this whole section on not doing that, like just be with a person, when they're dying.
Yes.
Yeah. So there's just another paradox, right?
Yeah. Isn't
So,
that interesting?
yeah. So, but it
Because
really got me thinking about it. All the people, has a whole chapter on all the people that he's been with, including Timothy Leary, when they were dying. So he's been in the presence of death for years. And he really got involved in that foundation on living and dying that he organized, that kind of grief. We've had a parent or a brother or sister or relative or somebody die, or we've been in the presence of death. So he really says that that's been the thing that has brought him some awakening and got him closer to this mystery of death and opened his heart to love around death.
it makes me think about how in previous times that was normal, whether it was a cremation out in the open or whether it was that someone dies and they're in the upstairs bedroom and people can go up and say their goodbyes to the remains of this person. And I'm also thinking that death was closer. People died younger. And the farther back you go, there were more things that could end someone's life. And so it was more a part of people's lives. So I wonder if we could go back and interview people from the 1900s, 1800s. Did they think about death? Probably. It was just this natural part of, it was there. Like for Ram Dass to say, as I got to be with people who were dying, then my understanding of death grew. And we, in this time, pretend that people aren't dying. And even when they die, like in a funeral parlor, they're made to look like they're just sleeping. So we're so much in denial in the moment of death. And then that go backwards in time, we're in denial, like the culture of youth, everything about it. I wanted to read a quote that I think relates to what we're talking about right now. The quote is from the book, "You've got to approach your dying the way you live your life, with curiosity, with hope, with fascination, with courage, and with the help of your friends. You've got to take charge of it, plan it, talk to your friends about it." So it's almost like, I feel like as we're talking about it today, this is one piece of bringing this back to people's consciousness as just a part of reality. And what do we do with it? We start talking about it. We start recognizing it. We start planning for it. We start supporting each other in their plans for it.
We get rid of our fear of being with people who are dying, and it's okay. You just have to be with them. He has this whole chapter on being a rock, to be a rock in the presence of
loving
someone
rock.
who's dying. A loving rock in the presence of someone who's dying. I really like that chapter.
Yes, me too.
Guidelines for being a loving rock for the dying is what it's called.
So I just want to say that what's coming to my mind as we're talking is C.S. Lewis wrote a book. It was an adult book series that was science fiction, Out of the Silent Planet. And in that, I still remember that one theme of this planet was that they all knew from the time they were born when they were going to die. And I read this probably 50 years ago, but I've remembered it because it was such a fascinating thought. And I've thought about it ever since, off and on, like, what would it be like if I was living this life right now, knowing that the exact day of my death? And in the book, C.S. Lewis wrote that they all knew when each other's death dates were. And on the day of so-and-so's death, they would gather, the whole community, in a circle, holding hands, standing there holding hands. And the person this was their death day would stand in the middle. And I think they would go around and all say something about what this person had meant to them. It's like, wow, that's an interesting thought. So I don't know what that means, since that's not our reality, but maybe that we try to do as much of that as we can, not knowing the death date, but just wanting the people in our lives to know what they mean to us.
Well, yeah, it's a process of sending people home that it's really clear and it's recognized in their culture. When he talks about forgiveness before death, and he says it in one of the chapters, the practicalities in the back of the book, which are definitely worth looking at. He talks about how to die without regret. And his advice for that is to tell your friends what you love about them while they're alive and while you're alive, and just do that before that person dies. And I think That's just such great, deep wisdom. And C.S. Lewis obviously knew that.
Yes.
C.S. Lewis also wrote a book called On Grief. It's a beautiful book. He wrote it after his wife died. The very transcending, beautiful.
He also wrote the book Surprised by Joy. Joy was his wife. He's just amazing. But I'm feeling very moved. I'm feeling my heart and soul are touched by this conversation, because this is what we're talking about, is the essence of both this moment, this life, and that death is the end of that. And that we know that. What does that mean about that? What does it mean for us and how we interact with each other and ourselves?
Yeah, it makes a big difference. You were just talking about forgiveness as being part of it. And I've mentioned this on the podcast before, that 2.5 years ago, when we were getting closer to starting this podcast, I went and I spent 2 months with my sister and her husband as they were dying, because they lived in a city where they had friends, but you can't depend on people that you've known for a few years to come and do all of the things that are involved. So I went and I stayed with them for a couple of months. Jen and I recorded our first episodes. Actually, I was in their guest bedroom. And part of that process was, by the time they passed away, and they each had 2 different cancers. So there were 4 cancers in that house. Actually, Kathy had 3 cancers, but there were 2 other ones. The one that she thought was going to kill her didn't. These other 2 did. So there were 5 cancers at least in that household, really kind of chewing it up. And what we did first was learn to forgive each other. My sister and I had a long history. We had known each other for 70 years. And if you have siblings, you know that it wasn't always pretty. So we on purpose chose to forgive each other for whatever it was that we thought had caused any separations years previous. You said, Janet, just being with the person, you said it too, Leslie, just being with the person, not chanting at them, not telling them how to die, not being their death guide or whatever, just being with them. And the thing about the loving rock is he described it as a place to push off from into the unknown. So you're at the edge of the ocean and you push off from a rock into the unknown and into the ocean. So we didn't do anything special. My sister, my brother-in-law, and I, it wasn't all rituals and burning incense and chanting. And we didn't talk about the afterlife. We didn't talk solidly about beliefs, except as in, if you're having conversations with people and you're not talking about that stuff, then I think you're missing something. But anyway, we'd sit around, we'd watch television shows together and just relax and be together. I don't know whether it made a huge difference to them and their dying and what came next for them, but it made a huge difference for me and my life from that point on. I was very different when I came back from that than I was when I went down there. I maybe based on what Ram Dass was saying in the book, is I might be better prepared for my own death, having sat with them through theirs. And death is a transition. And one of the things that I have been thinking is that death is temporary and grief is temporary, but death is temporary clearly in a belief system that has reincarnation in it, as Mirabai, Bush, and Ram Dass were talking about. You're going to die, but you'll be back. And at some period of time shortly on, you're going to be back, because your essence, your true self, never dies. Wasn't born, wasn't going to die, just moving through a different set of clothing. So death is temporary. And then when you get to the end of it, if you're the Buddha or somebody and you're achieve ultimate enlightenment and you don't come back again, obviously that death was temporary, because now you're just fully alive. You're the whole universe. So that teaching of be with people when they're dying, including yourself, and walking around is like, it's not morbid to be walking around feeling like I'm going to die soon, but this is awesome. Looking around, this is all miraculous. And yep, I'm going to die soon, but this is pretty good. This is pretty good right here.
And it can be, for me, I can walk around or be driving and think, wow, I'm alive. My eyes are working. I can see how beautiful the autumn colors are. Whatever it is I'm experiencing, I can remind myself consciously, I get to experience this because I'm still alive. And in this moment, this is what's happening. And then just to be thankful.
Yeah. Thankful is a good practice.
Well, this has been a wonderful conversation, and I hope we've given our listeners a lot to think about. But before we close, I just want to talk about the practicalities in the back of this book and recommend that people look at them, because it's interesting, as Janet mentioned, there are death doulas out there who help you to prepare for your own death. My church community has helped people to think about these things, and I think it's really important just thinking about it. And Ram Dass has given us not just the opportunity to read and think about it, but to have a conversation about it. It's really been helpful and comforting, even more comforting for me. So look at the back of the book on the chapter on being with the dying. There are guidelines for being with the dying. Look at the chapter on your own death, because you can imagine it, plan it, create sacred space around it. That was an interesting chapter. Have your last wishes, your final words. Think about those things. And then the chapter on after death, just look in the back of the book after you read this book. Don't pass it up. It's easy to kind of pass it up, but it's really good practical information. And I want to leave you with a couple of big questions about death and dying that Mirabai Bush asked Ram Dass, but you should just think about it. One question is, how afraid are you of dying? And the other question is, how do you envision your own death? So have fun and enjoy pondering these questions. Don't be afraid to talk about it with people, because they're probably dying to talk about it with you.
Hey, you've been waiting for that. You've been dying to say that the whole time.
That's awesome.
No, I haven't actually. Just came to me.
Well, I just
then.
want to say, as we're ending, that I love you, Leslie, and I'm looking forward to having conversations about dying. And Gregg, I love you, and I'm glad that we also will be able to have conversations about dying.
Wow.
Thanks, Janet.
That's really nice. But I have to say, though, that I'm not ready to be done yet. Before we go away, I want to do a shout out to Mirabai Bush, because this was a book by Ram Dass and Mirabai Bush. And we've said Ram Dass this and Ram Dass that. I want to do a shout out to Mirabai Bush, because she was the perfect companion to have along in this conversation with Ram Dass. She knew him intimately. She knew his spiritual tradition and his teachings intimately. She also loved his guru, their guru, really. And throughout the writing of this book, the feeling that I got from her was the feeling that I got and have gotten from other very special teachers, and I suppose you could use the word guru, over the years, which is just a playful joyfulness in the whole thing, and a good attitude toward all of it. Here, our dear friend was dying, and she wasn't weeping and moaning and rending her clothes and doing all that stuff. She did some of that, but she mostly was, ain't life grand, and doesn't this all feel good? And to me, you guys read quotes a lot, and I don't, so I'm going to read a quote from something that she said in the book that kind of encapsulates, I think, what I just said, but also oldishness. It's the clearest expression of oldishness that I can recall in everything that we've been talking about for the last 2.5 years. So I'm going to read this quote. She had been sitting with Ram Dass in the evening, and she went downstairs to get ready to go to bed at night. She was visiting him in his house in Maui, and she was getting ready to go to bed. And she said, in the bathroom, I look in the mirror and see an aging face. Why don't people get more beautiful as they age? I know, Georgia O'Keeffe did and Ella Fitzgerald did, but not most of us. So I take off my glasses, and amazingly, I look like I have the skin of a Botticelli Madonna. We manipulate our lives so we can see what we want to see. Hard to accept, but true. I look old because I am old, which means that I am going to die soon. It would be good to think about that more often, and to remember that this is not the face of my soul. And it would also be good to apply a little more moisturizer.
Okay, Greg.
That's oldish.
That's
And
great.
I want to say that one thing that Mirabai did that I appreciated was that she would bring in parts of past speeches that Ram Dass had given when he could talk pre-stroke about the topic that whatever they were talking about, whatever aspect of dying and living and souls. So I felt like we were held, by her as she organized this conversation with Ram Dass and was able to fill in parts and add parts and add her own experiences. So yeah, I agree that she just seemed like the perfect person to join with him on this.
I am enormously grateful for the opportunity that we've had to be doing this together, the three of us. I love you both. The conversations that we have are really rich and fun. Even talking about death, we've been laughing the whole time, which I think is remarkable. And in the Buddhist tradition, there is a thing called a Sangha, which is spiritual friends. So originally it was a group of monks who gathered around the Buddha. They were called the Sangha. And Ram Dass and Mirabai Bush refer to the Sangha in the book. But right at the end of the book, when Ram Dass is talking about what comes next, he talks about something that he calls a spiritual pod. It's a pretty rich pun, but mostly what he's talking about is a pod like a pod of dolphins, where after you die, you're greeted by this group of souls that you've been traveling through incarnations with. And they greet you as souls, as open hearts, as true hearts. Kurt Vonnegut referred to that in one of his books as the religion of Bakonanism. Vonnegut invented the Karas, which is a group of souls who have been traveling together down through the eons, learning, helping each other learn, holding each other up, being part of support systems, being mothers, fathers, brothers, sisters, friends, enemies, alternatively, to help you learn all the things.
I think you've met those people. I can just resonates with me because I think in your life you run into those people. You meet those people that you're gonna the people in your pod. They may be people you don't know, but they may be also people that you do know.
I think you're both in my pod.
That's exactly my point, because I've been having this conversation in my
You
pod.
think, wow, that's interesting.
So
yeah,
that's exactly.
I agree.
wow,
I agree.
That's profound, Greg.
Yeah.
It's interesting.
Well, it's also really fun. Well, goodbye, Leslie and Jen.
This has been a great time talking together, and I'm so thankful that the three of us could be here together. This is a topic that we could talk about forever, for the rest of our lives until our deaths. And maybe we'll come back to it with another book or another conversation. So as always, we'd love to hear your comments, questions, recommendations for future podcast themes. Thank you so much for being on this journey with us.
That's it for now. Thanks for listening. We enjoyed our visit and hope you did too. You can find links to Walking Each Other Home and other works by Ram Dass and Mirabai Bush in the show notes and on our website at www.oldish.me. While you're there, please leave a comment, a rating, or a review, and please consider a subscription to help support the podcast. Most importantly, please do as we just did and find an opportunity to tell someone you love them.